Is the U.S. on the brink of a fiscal collapse?
We did not get into this fiscal mess overnight.
That's true. For decades, whether Republican or Democrat, administration or Congress, everyone has contributed to driving up the U.S. debt dramatically. It now sits at $36 trillion. In fact, U.S. debt held by the public, it's actually about to surpass the entire economic output of the U.S.
Our next story is from Africa. It's about the entire continent, the youngest and fastest growing continent in the world. About 40% of the people in Africa are under 15 years old, and that is where the future is. The future workforce and the future market. At least one American company has realized this, and it's readying itself for an African future. I'm talking about the global streaming giant Netflix. Netflix is prepared to bet big on Africa, both as a market and as a source of content.
Before I came to Africa, I worried a lot, like anybody else. This and that, this is no good, that is no good, this is not safe, everything. But I said, no matter whatever you worry, you have to step on Africa and feel it and touch it yourself. So I came. I thought, it's too late. Why didn't I came 10 years ago? Africa is a continent of
business sectors. In recent years, most of the new billionaires have been young entrepreneurs and investors who have created promising businesses and invested in lucrative sectors of Africa's fast-growing economies. Everyone knows Africa is the future. That is why many foreign investors from China, the United States, and India are coming to invest in Africa. They have identified markets and they are succeeding. There is a wide list of businesses in Africa that you can invest in and make so much money. By our top 10 today.
Africa is the only way out. It's the golden and it's the holy grail for your freedom. Like, if Americans, African Americans specifically, don't see that investing in Africa changes everything for you, I mean, all the way down to generational wealth. Like, Africa's in a position where if African Americans take position now, you guys, every single African American in America would be a millionaire without even thinking twice, because there's nothing that's not needed over there. So you guys come with the discipline, you come with the knowledge, you come with the...
African Americans built this nation. You built this nation. You know, you're just starting to get real credit for that. Okay, I don't know if you know that. You're just starting to get, you built the nation. We all built it, but you were such a massive part of it. Bigger than you were given credit for. Does that make sense? Right? But through generations of blood, sweat, and tears, and you deserve a government that defends your interests, protects your families, and cares for our own citizens first. My administration is fighting with everyone and all our heart to reverse the pain inflicted by Democrat leaders and to deliver hope and opportunity and prosperity for all Americans, but for African American communities all throughout our land.
For decades, the United States benefited quietly but significantly from the economic energy of African American entrepreneurs, professionals, investors, and consumers. From agriculture and logistics to technology, entertainment, real estate, and finance, Black-owned businesses and institutions formed a powerful but often underappreciated pillar of the American economy. That pillar is now shifting, not suddenly, not dramatically in a single announcement, but steadily and unmistakably. Across boardrooms, investment networks, trade missions, churches, family offices, digital platforms, and cooperative societies, capital is flowing outward. Increasingly, it is flowing toward Africa. Inside Washington, the concern is not ideological. It is arithmetic. Over the last decade, African American-led enterprises have expanded. International exposure at a pace that surprised regulators and policymakers. What began as cultural reconnection through travel, tourism, and philanthropy evolved into structured trade, manufacturing partnerships, fintech platforms, logistics corridors, agribusiness investments, and energy projects across multiple African regions. Today, economists tracking Diaspora capital estimate that cumulative business, relocations, equity shifts, reinvestment pipelines, supplier migration, and long-term commitments connected to Africa are approaching the scale of hundreds of billions of dollars over time. The figure often cited in policy discussions, around $200 billion, is not a single ledger entry. It is the aggregation of momentum, The anxiety in Washington stems from what that momentum represents. This is not capital flight driven by crisis. It is strategic reallocation driven by opportunity, sovereignty, and long-term vision. For many African American business leaders, the United States has become a harder environment in which to scale. Structural barriers to capital access remain persistent. Lending gaps between Black-owned firms and their counterparts continue despite decades of reform initiatives. Federal contracting promises have repeatedly fallen short of targets. Regulatory complexity often punishes smaller firms while favoring entrenched incumbents. Inflation. Rising commercial rents and consolidation across retail, agriculture, and logistics have narrowed margins. At the same time, Africa has changed. The Africa of today is not the Africa of outdated policy briefings. It is a continent of expanding consumer markets, accelerating urbanization, digital leapfrogging, and assertive economic nationalism. Governments are rewriting investment codes. Regional trade frameworks are lowering cross-border friction. Infrastructure corridors are connecting ports, industrial zones, and inland production hubs. Mobile banking penetration has surpassed that of many developed economies. Renewable energy, agritech, mineral processing, and digital services are no longer aspirational sectors, they are operational realities. African American investors see what many Western institutions were slow to recognize. Proximity to growth matters more than proximity to legacy power. The emotional dimension of this shift cannot be separated from the economic one. For generations, African American wealth creation in the United States was constrained not just by markets, but by history. Land loss, redlining, exclusion from credit systems, discriminatory zoning, and underinvestment in Black communities left scars that still shape business decisions today. When entrepreneurs look abroad, they are not simply chasing profit. They are seeking environments where ownership feels durable, where partnership feels reciprocal, and where their presence is not treated as an exception. Africa offers something the U.S. has struggled to provide consistently, a sense of belonging aligned with economic agency. This is especially visible in sectors where African American businesses already possess deep expertise. Agriculture is one of the clearest examples. Black farmers in the U.S. have faced decades of land loss, consolidation pressure, and uneven access to subsidies. In contrast, African nations eager to modernize agriculture have welcomed diaspora expertise in mechanization, storage, processing, and export logistics. Cooperative farming models, joint ventures, and agro-industrial parks have become entry points for capital that once circulated domestically. Technology is another major channel. African American founders who faced persistent underfunding in U.S. venture capital markets discovered that African tech ecosystems offered faster pilot programs, lower user acquisition costs, and regulatory environments open to experimentation. Fintech platforms serving underbanked populations, health tech solutions adapted to low infrastructure settings, and e-commerce logistics tailored to informal markets have scaled rapidly. These companies often maintain U.S. headquarters for legal reasons while directing growth capital, talent, and innovation pipelines toward Africa. Manufacturing and industrial services reveal an even more strategic dimension of the shift. As global supply chains fragment, diaspora-led firms are positioning Africa as a production base rather than merely a consumer market. Textile manufacturing, food processing, building materials, pharmaceuticals, and light engineering have all attracted investment. These are not extractive operations. They are vertically integrated ventures designed to serve regional markets first and global markets second. From Washington's perspective, the concern is cumulative erosion. Each relocated supplier contract, each redirected investment fund, each manufacturing plant built abroad represents not just lost tax revenue but lost influence. Economic power translates into political leverage, cultural authority, and strategic resilience. When capital follows identity and opportunity elsewhere, the center of gravity shifts. The federal government has attempted to respond through renewed engagement initiatives, trade summits, and diaspora outreach programs. Yet many African American business leaders view these efforts as reactive rather than transformative. The incentives offered rarely match the scale of opportunity abroad. More importantly, they do not address the underlying trust deficit created by decades of inconsistent policy follow-through. Africa, by contrast, is actively courting diaspora, a capital with language that resonates. Policy frameworks emphasize partnership rather than aid. Citizenship pathways, land use rights, investment protections, and diaspora bonds are designed to anchor long-term commitment. Cultural diplomacy reinforces economic messaging, framing return, not as charity but as strategy. Another factor intensifying Washington's unease is the geopolitical context. As Africa diversifies its global partnerships, diaspora capital becomes a force multiplier. African American businesses often act as bridges between markets, facilitating technology transfer, standards alignment, and global financing. When these bridges orient away from U.S. centrality, they weaken Washington's ability to shape outcomes indirectly. There is also a narrative dimension at play. The United States has long positioned itself as the ultimate destination for Black aspiration. The visible movement of capital, talent, and entrepreneurial energy toward Africa challenges that story. It signals that prosperity is no longer geographically monopolized. For younger generations watching this shift, the implications are profound. Career planning, educational choices, and identity formation are all influenced by perceived centers of opportunity. Critics argue that fears of panic are exaggerated, noting that much diaspora capital remains tied to U.S. financial systems. That is true for now, but influence is not determined solely by where accounts are held. It is determined by where decisions are made, where growth occurs, and where futures are imagined. On those measures, Africa's pull is strengthening. The estimated $200 billion figure often cited reflects more than direct investment. It includes redirected procurement contracts, rerouted supply chains, intellectual property commercialization abroad, joint ventures, and long-term market commitments. It reflects intention as much as transaction, and intention is what policymakers fear most because it signals trajectory. What Washington faces is not an exodus, but a rebalancing. African American businesses are not abandoning the United States. They are diversifying away from dependency. That distinction matters. A diversified economic actor has leverage. A dependent one does not. The deeper question confronting U.S. leadership is whether the country can adapt to this new reality. Retaining diaspora capital will require more than symbolic gestures. It will require structural reform in access to finance, procurement, equity, land ownership protections, and wealth-building mechanisms. It will require treating African American enterprise not as a social issue but as a strategic economic asset. Africa's rise is not waiting for American permission, and African American businesses, informed by history and motivated by possibility, are positioning themselves accordingly. Washington's panic is rooted in recognition. Recognition that a long-ignored constituency has options. Recognition that global power is diffusing. Recognition that economic allegiance follows respect, opportunity, and agency. The movement of capital tells a story words cannot obscure. And the story unfolding now suggests that the future of Black enterprise is increasingly global, increasingly African-connected, and increasingly independent of traditional centers of power. Whether the United States responds with reform or resistance will shape not only its relationship with Africa, but its relationship with its own people in the decades to come. The shift of African American capital toward Africa has also exposed a contradiction at the heart of American economic policy. For decades, policymakers promoted globalization as an engine of prosperity, encouraging companies to seek growth wherever markets expanded fastest. Now, as a historically marginalized community applies that same logic to its own future, the response from Washington is marked by unease. The concern is not that capital is moving abroad. The concern is who is moving it, why they are moving it, and what that movement says about confidence in the domestic system. What unsettles federal institutions most is that this migration is not driven by tax evasion or regulatory escape. It is driven by alignment. African American entrepreneurs increasingly report that African markets offer something rare. Governments eager to negotiate, communities invested in shared outcomes, and populations hungry for innovation rather than suspicious of it. In many cases, diaspora businesses are invited to co-design policy frameworks, advise on industrial planning, and participate in national development strategies. This level of engagement contrasts sharply with their experiences at home, where access to decision-making spaces has often been limited as capital flows outward. Secondary effects ripple inward. Employment patterns begin to change. Skilled professionals split time between continents or relocate entirely. Engineering, finance, logistics, and software talent that once fueled U.S. firms now contributes to African-based operations. Universities notice shifts in enrollment interests. Students increasingly pursue international business, African studies, supply chain management, and energy systems linked to emerging markets rather than traditional Western corporate pathways. The U.S. labor market absorbs these changes slowly, but the long-term impact is structural. When innovation ecosystems lose diversity of thought and experience, they lose resilience. African American entrepreneurs have historically been among the most adaptive, often building businesses in hostile environments with limited capital. That resilience, when redirected abroad, strengthens competitors rather than domestic industries. Another dimension rarely discussed openly in Washington is narrative power. Economic influence shapes storytelling. As African American-led enterprises succeed in Africa, they reshape how the continent is perceived within the diaspora and beyond. Africa is no longer framed solely as a site of extraction, charity, or geopolitical competition. It becomes a place of agency, innovation, and leadership. That reframing undermines decades of media, academic, and policy narratives that position development as something delivered to Africa rather than built with it. This narrative shift has political consequences. Diaspora communities begin advocating for foreign policies that reflect partnership rather than dominance. Voting blocs become more attentive to international trade, sanctions, and diplomatic posture. Policymakers accustomed to predictable alignments find themselves navigating a more complex constituency whose interests are transnational. The financial system feels the strain as well. While most capital transfers remain compliant with U.S. regulations, the diversification of assets into African markets reduces reliance on American financial institutions. Diaspora-led funds increasingly source financing from global partners, regional development banks, and alternative markets. This weakens the soft power traditionally exercised through dollar dominance and financial gatekeeping. Africa, for its part, has learned from history. Governments are cautious but strategic in welcoming diaspora capital. Lessons from exploitative investment models have informed stricter local content rules, value-add requirements, and technology transfer expectations. African American businesses often find these terms acceptable, even attractive, because they emphasize long-term stability over short-term extraction. The result is deeper integration rather than transactional engagement. Washington's internal debates reflect a growing awareness that traditional tools may be insufficient. Trade incentives alone cannot reverse a movement rooted in identity, dignity, and strategic foresight. Aid frameworks appear outdated in a world where African economies increasingly set their own priorities. Even security partnerships are being reassessed as African states diversify alliances and assert autonomy. The question increasingly asked in policy circles is whether the United States misread the moment by treating African American economic participation as a domestic equity issue rather than a geopolitical asset. Opportunities were missed. Instead of building global black enterprise networks anchored in the U.S., policymakers allowed frustration to fester. Now, those networks are forming independently with Africa as a central node. There is also a generational element driving momentum. Younger African Americans are less tied to the idea that success must be validated by American institutions. Digital connectivity has flattened access to information and opportunity. Social media, fintech, and remote work have made transcontinental collaboration normal rather than exceptional. For this generation, Africa is not a distant homeland but a viable frontier for ambition. Cultural exchange reinforces economic commitment. Music, fashion, film, and media collaborations strengthen emotional ties that translate into business loyalty. When people invest where they feel seen and valued, capital follows conviction rather than convenience. Critics warn that Africa still faces governance challenges, infrastructure gaps, and political risk. These concerns are real, but they are not disqualifying. Investors accustomed to navigating systemic barriers in the U.S. are often well equipped to manage complexity elsewhere. Moreover, risk is increasingly offset by growth potential. For many, the upside outweighs uncertainty. From Washington's perspective, the most alarming aspect may be the durability of the shift once supply chains, production facilities, and consumer bases are established. Reversal becomes unlikely. Capital anchored in long-term projects does not return easily. It compounds where it is planted. The estimated scale of $200 billion reflects not just money but momentum. It represents trust transferred from one system to another. Rebuilding that trust domestically would require more than rhetoric. It would require demonstrable reform, consistent enforcement of equity policies, and genuine inclusion in economic decision-making. The United States still holds immense advantages: advanced infrastructure, deep capital markets, research institutions, and global influence, but advantages erode when stakeholders feel undervalued. Africa's rise as a destination for diaspora capital is not an indictment of America's potential. It is a critique of its priorities. The continuation of this trend will reshape global economics in subtle but profound ways. Africa's industrial base will deepen. Its bargaining power in global trade will increase. Diaspora networks will blur the line between domestic and foreign policy. Meanwhile, the U.S. will face increasing pressure to compete not just with other nations, but with the consequences of its own neglect. In the end, Washington's panic is not about loss alone. It is about realization. The realization that economic loyalty cannot be assumed, that historical resilience can become strategic independence, that communities long treated as peripheral can redefine the center. The movement of African American capital toward Africa signals a broader truth about the modern world. Power is no longer static. It flows toward places that offer agency, partnership, and possibility. Africa, once positioned at the margins of global strategy, is asserting itself as a destination of choice rather than necessity. Whether the United States adapts or resists will determine its role in this new era. What is clear is that the shift is already underway. It is deliberate, informed, and deeply rooted in lived experience. And once capital learns that it has options, it rarely chooses confinement again.